If you've ever dealt with apologists, then the likelihood you've heard a soundbite argument is high. What is a soundbite argument? It's a short, quippy-sounding sentence that's supposed to stump the opposition, forcing them to completely reevaluate their position on an issue. Soundbite arguments are also often presented as standalone arguments. Each one may consist of one or perhaps two short sentences. Surely, evaluation and reevaluation of ideas is a must for logical discourse. However, odds are that soundbite arguments aren't the path to critical thinking. Why not? Well, more likely than not, the issue being argued is one couched in a number of implications, so the reformation of one point can drastically affect others. When looking at arguments between scientists or philosophers of science, the points being presented are often complex and backed up with much empirical evidence or sound reasoning, not short, facile sentences. Let's take an example. If humans are evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? This question is often posed by creationists to people who accept evolution to get the evolution acceptor to think two things: that humans are descended from modern monkeys and that descent with modification necessitates the extinction of close relatives. While the question may sound reasonable, it belies a fundamental lack of understanding of natural selection, speciation, common ancestry, extinction events, and evolution as a whole. In short, the origination of new species doesn't necessitate the extinction of close relatives. For instance, when new cichlid species arise, their cousin species don't automatically go extinct. And if that were truly the case, then the Earth would only have one single species on it. The reason for this is that every time a new species formed, the parent species would go extinct, so only one species should exist at a time. The other issue with this soundbite argument that completely decimates it is that we're not descended from any species of modern monkeys. We humans share a common ancestor with Old World monkeys, or Cercopithecus, that lived about 25 million years ago, and we share a common ancestor with New World monkeys, or Platyrrhines, that lived about 40 million years ago. We aren't descended from either of these primate clades, but we are descended from catarrhine primates akin to the Oligocene monkey Aegyptopithecus. What's wrong with this argument is explained quite well by, ironically, Answers in Genesis in the article, "If Humans Evolved from Apes, Why Do Apes Exist Today?" It says, quote, "This argument shows a misunderstanding of what evolutionists actually believe about human evolution. The evolutionary concept of the origin of humans is not based on humans descending from modern apes, but, rather, argues that humans and modern apes share a common ancestor." Close quote. The article goes on to do a pretty good explanation of the basic scenario that would have resulted in the split between apes and modern Cercopithecus. So, even though AIG has a statement of faith that includes the sentence, quote, "By definition, no apparent or perceived or claimed evidence in any field, including history and chronology, can be valid if it contradicts a scriptural record," close quote, they at least have enough intellectual honesty to admit when an argument is bad, something Kent Hovind lacks. Another bad argument they point out is Charles Darwin's supposed deathbed conversion, because evolution would still be true even if Darwin became a Christian at the end of his life. Now, even though I just praised AIG for having the decency to point out when some of their own arguments are fallacious, they of course had to ruin their good streak. On the AIG page, Arguments to Avoid, a video and a list of topics comes up, and in the video, astrophysicist Jason Lisle explains how to talk to an evolutionist. He advocates, quite justifiably, that the evolutionists define his or her terms, like evolution or science. However, while standing on his soapbox, he presents two soundbite arguments. How could asexual organisms evolve into sexual organisms, and how does genetic information arise? Lisle, while probably intelligent in astrophysics, absolutely strikes out in biology. The first problem with the asexual to sexual organisms argument is that the evolution from asexual reproducers to sexual reproducers has not gone unnoticed by scientists. In fact, the 1972 paper, The Origin and Evolution of Gamete Dimorphism and the Male-Female Phenomenon, says, quote, "The classical theory for the origin of anisogamy, or having two classes of gametes, is that the greatest number of successful fusions occurs when the gametic material available for the population is divided with a high degree of anisogamy. When the model is modified to include inheritance of gamete size by simple Mendelian dominance, it is shown that as the initial range of variance is increased, the range of X, where fitness is proportional to volumes, which generates stable dimorphism, also increases. As high anisogamy is approached, the disadvantageous dominant homozygote is lost, leaving two sexes, sperm producers and ovum producers, in a stable 1-to-1 ratio. Close quote. The question is now of whether Lyell was totally unaware of the research or if he simply ignored it because it didn't fit with his narrative. And what about the DNA information soundbite argument? This generally goes as follows. DNA has information in the same way that CDs or books have information, but the information on CDs and books comes from a mind. Therefore, DNA information was created by a mind. Lyell should have taken his own advice here and defined information because I have no idea what it means in this context. After all, much of DNA has no function, and some of it is the remains of viral infections that afflicted our ancestors. These viruses got stuck in our genome as endogenous retroviruses, and humans share about 99% of endogenous retroviruses with chimps. Coincidence? So, do endogenous retroviruses count as information? And how, if possible, could information be increased in the genome? A definition here would certainly help. It seems fitting, then, that Lyell's video would end up on the page, Arguments to Avoid. Lyell also strikes out when it comes to information for the following reason. A robust treatment of just what information is must take into account what information theorists say about it. Many of these soundbite arguments will rely at least in part on what Claude Shannon had to say on the subject. Shannon was a communications engineer and mostly concerned with fidelity in transmission and reception of signals. In that light, there's a maximum information content defined by complete and accurate transmission and reception of a signal. Any noise introduced between transmission and reception, therefore, constitutes a reduction in information. We can then think of information as being reduction in uncertainty, and this is precisely how Shannon defines it. When the apologist talks about the notion of no new information, this is what he's relying on. However, Shannon's isn't the only way to talk about information. In another treatment, that of Andrei Kolmogorov, the central concern is information storage and, in particular, the amount by which information can be compressed without any loss. The more complex the information, the less it could be compressed. In this light, then, any noise introduced between transmission and reception is, in fact, an increase in information because it increases complexity. DNA is fully a Kolmogorov information system. Indeed, the fact that DNA can be used to encode any information we choose, a function of the fact that it exists in discrete states, is precisely because it's a Kolmogorov system. It is important to understand that not all soundbite arguments concern science. Some of them deal with epistemology, or the study of knowledge, as well. An example would be if a hack philosopher were to ask if absolute truth exists, which is truth that transcends time and space. Whether you answer yes or no doesn't matter because the question's loaded. If you say yes, then the apologist will start on his or her spiel about how absolute truth can only be explained in light of his or her very specific deity. If you say no, the apologist will laugh and ask, "Are you absolutely certain?" That way, it again doesn't matter if you answer yes or no because the question is loaded. Either answer will earn you a laugh and a note on what the apologist perceives to be your inconsistent worldview. Now let's take apart why this is a bad argument. The first issue here is again a problem of definitions. What is meant by absolute? If a concept is true in an epistemic framework and under certain conditions, then it's true. That's tautological and there's no need to qualify said truth. You might as well say there's truth and there's true truth, but immediately one would realize that that doesn't make any sense. If a proposition already qualifies as true, then why would we need to state if it's more true than other true propositions? That's the core issue here. True isn't a state of reality, it's a state of propositions within a certain epistemic framework. So how could a proposition that's true within a certain epistemic framework transcend said framework, not to mention the universe within which the framework exists? How would that work? 2 + 2 = 4 is definitionally true within the framework that humans have debated and agreed upon. However, to an alien who believes that our concept of 4 equals their concept of 5, 2 + 2 = 5 is definitionally true for them. This same rebuttal also blows out of the water the apologetic argument that words have unchangeable definitions. For reference, this argument is sometimes employed to say that the Bible has one specific interpretation. Anyway, the point is that the concept of absolute truth that transcends epistemic frameworks is without merit. Thus, next time an apologist asks you if you're absolutely certain that absolute truth doesn't exist, answer yes. Then, proceed to ask for a definition of absolute truth and explain why the concept is bogus. Another important example is one that actually arises from the scientific literature, the most popular understanding of what Darwin's mechanism of natural selection entails, namely survival of the fittest. Render in the vernacular definition of fitness, this is entirely misleading, and suggests that the strongest, fastest, etc. will be the ones that survive and pass on their genes. However, it doesn't tell the whole story. The most important concern here is the oft misunderstood fact that organisms in competition with each other are members of the same species. Moreover, in the full technical definition of the term, fitness is a measure of performance against expected number of offspring, and competition is defined against this measure. Survival, then, is defined by reproduction, and survival of the fittest becomes, when rigorously defined, a simple tautology. In the vernacular, it would be more accurately defined as survival of the sufficiently fit, on average, but that's not nearly as pithy. It's important to note that not all sound bites fall prey to this. When terms are sufficiently well defined, such sound bites can actually serve to distill our arguments and aid understanding. For example, we often hear the argument that DNA is a code, but this is misleading. DNA is a molecule. The genetic code is the treatment we apply to it to help us understand it better. This can be encapsulated in the simple soundbite, DNA is a code in precisely the same way that London is a map. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.